going on? Welcome to the Blue Shoes Fitness Podcast, where we talk about strength training, nutrition, faith, family, and how all of those things work together for parents like you and me. My name is Coach Jay, and today I'm going to be sharing a few thoughts with you about one of the prevailing debates in the fitness world and how it applies to you and your own training. First, let's kick things off with the verse of the week, and we are going old school in the Old Testament here from the book of Lamentations. And I promise this is exciting despite the name of the book, Lamentations. This is Lamentations 3:22 and 23. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I was reminded of this passage earlier this week listening to another podcast, and the version that the pastor was reading out of said that the Lord's mercies are new every morning. And I loved that imagery, and so I wanted to read it for myself here. And so, if you're not familiar, a real brief overview rather than doing a deep dive here is Lamentations is the book that is immediately following the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And the book of Jeremiah ends with the fall and capture of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And Jeremiah is distraught over this. And partially for this reason, many scholars believe that Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations as well. And regardless of who wrote it, this book is a big long lament over the fall of the great city. And this is one of the rare glimpses within the book where we see that there is hope and there is a light at the end of the tunnel for God's people. And I love this because this is so applicable to where we are now. No matter where you are in your life or what stage of life you're in, what stage of parenting you're in, what stage of anything that you're in, this is something that we can rely on, that the Lord's compassions never fail and that they're new every morning, and that he's faithful. All right, let's get into the topic today. So, this is my take on weighing in on the volume versus intensity debate. And I am no stranger to who the average listener of this podcast is. You might not have an entire bookshelf like I do behind me, full of physiology and nutrition and anatomy textbooks. You might just be thinking, hey, maybe I do enjoy working out to a degree, but it's not my life. And more or less, it's sort of a means to an end, whether that's stress relief, whether that's an aesthetic goal that you have, whatever that looks like for you. I understand that most people listening to this are not fitness geeks and nerds like I am and like I tend to hang out with. But this is why this topic matters to you. Let's talk about why it matters, and then we'll actually talk about what the debate is. So this matters to you because as with a lot of areas in fitness, there are a lot of ways of trying to create proprietary approaches to fitness so that people can market it to you. And this is a little bit of a me wanting to help protect you in teaching you some defensive skills here, that it's not that you have to be total, red flags around anytime somebody comes up with something new. However, you should be a little bit wary in recognizing that if somebody has this brand new proprietary approach of thinking, how did this person come up with this all by themselves with no scholarship or research to back it up, and it's just all of a sudden something that they're really promoting and they're really harping on. And at the time of this recording, Liver King has been the topic of many a fitness discussion, and if you're not familiar with him, that's all good, you're not missing out on much. But this is a great example of somebody who had a very proprietary system and approach, and it turns out that that really wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. So I want to help protect you in that way. And on a very practical level, from something that we all deal with, is I want to help you to discern between a workout or a workout program that feels productive versus one that is productive. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but sometimes there is a difference. Not always. Sometimes things that are productive do feel productive as well, but there are many workout programs out there that are available that really feel productive, and it really feels like you're doing something. And you just might not be doing the kinds of things that are actually going to help you move the needle toward your goals. So I want to help you on that side of it as well. All right, so in this debate of volume versus intensity, let's talk about what those even mean, because you may be thinking, I have no clue what volume or intensity means as they pertain to fitness. So we're talking about training volume and training intensity. So let me give you a couple quick definitions of these, and then we'll talk about what the debate itself is. Training volume is the cumulative work done in your workouts, usually delineated by a muscle group or by movement pattern. It's a combination of your sets and your reps and your load. You might classify this as your training volume per training session or workout, or maybe you look at it over the course of a training week. The idea is that training volume is how much you're doing overall. So that might be for a particular muscle group. You might look at your training volume for your biceps, for example, or for your delts, your shoulders. You might look at that as classifying it by how much weight you're able to lift for how many repetitions over the course of how many sets, things like that. You kind of get the idea that this is somewhat of a big picture absolute sort of thing of let's look at the training volume for any particular muscle group or maybe movement pattern. Maybe it's not a specific muscle, but maybe it's like a squat based pattern. So that's training volume. Training intensity is not so much how much you're doing, but it's how difficult that is or how intense that exercise is or that total amount of volume that you're doing. You might look at this as the difficulty of a set in proximity to muscular failure. So it doesn't mean that you have to reach failure all the time, but we can quantify this in terms of how close to muscular failure you're reaching. So when we're talking about strength training, we are not talking about intensity in terms of some of the other factors that you might think that feel productive, as you might see in a lot of, for example, HIT classes or training sessions or any kind of interval training. We're not talking about this being in relation to your heart rate being jacked up. We're not talking about how hard you're breathing or how much you're sweating. Those are all factors that might be byproducts of having a high level of training intensity within your strength training work, but those are not the factors that determine the intensity. It's not about, oh, I really sweat a whole bunch. That was a really intense training session. That's not really how we use this phrase training intensity in strength training. We can also quantify this metric as well. So intensity can be quantified using scales like RPE or RIR, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. So now that we have an idea of what training volume looks like and what training intensity looks like, let's talk about what the actual debate is. And here it is. The debate is over the question, which is more important, training volume or training intensity? Like I said, you may not be particularly caring about the winner of this debate or the nuance of it or the intricacies that go kind of behind it in the research. You might not really be looking for all that. You might just be looking for a, hey, what actually do I need to be paying attention to in my workouts? And I want to help you address that from your perspective as a parent listening to this podcast. You might not care about any of the other implications of this besides the implications for your own workouts. And like I said, this is all about coming down to discerning between a workout or a workout program that feels productive versus one that is productive. And that's why we're talking about this here. So, a lot of people will view training volume and training intensity on a sliding scale as if it was a spectrum where on one side you have volume and on the other side you have intensity. And a specific workout or workout program or approach to fitness or to strength training or to hypertrophy, I mean, we're talking about all of these kinds of things here, that it's somewhere that you could pinpoint somewhere along that spectrum or that sliding scale of where that particular program or workout falls. So you might say that something is higher volume but lower intensity, or maybe the opposite. Maybe it's lower volume but higher intensity. And to a degree, these are not opposites. However, they are usually kind of a give and take where you're typically not going to have any sort of program that's going to be long term sustainable that is going to be both high volume and high intensity all the time without breaks or exceptions. Likewise, you're probably not going to have a very productive program that is super low training volume and super low training intensity. You just don't typically see programs that are on either end of that. However, we can also rule out the extremes that are on that scale itself of just totally on the side of the all training volume and virtually no training intensity, or the opposite of complete 100% intensity but very little minimal training volume. Those are not going to be, again, the approaches that you see on a regular basis, and it's probably neither of those are going to be approaches that you're probably going to want to take in your own training because, as we'll see, they are not going to be leading to the adaptations that you're probably looking for if you are here listening to this podcast. And of course, I can't speak for everybody, but the majority of you listening to this are probably going to get some kind of benefit out of learning what these two traits mean and what these two variables are and how they are applied to your own program. So let's talk about one quick thing. So if you were on the side of all training volume and very little intensity, let's use the squat, for example. That might look something along the line of just doing body weight squats. No matter how easy those got, you just continually did body weight squats, and the only way that you can really make that more challenging is if you're not adding weight or load to it, that you're just doing more repetitions and more sets and more training sessions per week using squats. That would be a very high volume, very low intensity approach. On the flip side, a high intensity but very low volume approach might be something like just doing 1 RM. So you have your 1 rep max squat, and let's say that for one repetition, the maximum that you can do is 135 pounds. And let's say you do that once a week. You do a single squat once a week, and that's it. That would be something that might be high intensity, very high intensity, and very, very low volume. So you can see that neither of those approaches, kind of intuitively, you understand that's probably not going to be the way to go. And if you have any experience with any sort of training program, whether it's online or from a coach, you will likely recognize that they have taken neither of those approaches as well. A quick note on this here is that there are some practical limitations when it comes to where you find yourself on the spectrum and recognizing that they're not mutually exclusive. When it comes to your schedule and your time, you can imagine that in that squat example, that if you did just hundreds and hundreds of bodyweight squats with very low intensity and very high volume, that would just take an insane amount of time. Imagine that was your training program. Let's you say 5 6 7 days a week. That's all you ever did was just body weight versions of that exercise. That would take a crazy amount of time, and for parents like us, that sort of limitation that we have on our schedule is pretty that's probably not going to be a great approach, right? Even outside of the physiological side of it, just from a practical and schedule point of view, that's probably not going to be a very helpful approach. And so we can also limit that side of things for that reason. So, as much as I want to share with you the coaching perspective of this, of giving you a well, it depends sort of answer, I will give you my take on this. Just a couple points of my point of view on this volume and intensity debate here. First of all, we need to recognize, and I mentioned this, but we need to recognize that these two terms are not mutually exclusive. They are on kind of opposite sides of the spectrum in some way, but we don't have to stick with one side of that or even one point along that spectrum for the entirety of our training program. We can jump around from place to place, from one workout to the next and one exercise to the next when we're talking about one muscle group to the next. We have many ways that we can add flexibility into this. So they're not mutually exclusive. We can have moments of high volume and high intensity. We can have moments of low volume and low intensity. So we don't need to get hung up on the fact that we have to choose one or the other. However, I know that seems a little wishy-washy and a little non-committal, both sides of the fence sort of position. So I do want to put my foot on the ground and say that both aspects are very important to your training program. And this is a lot of the practical aspects of for you as a parent who just wants to use fitness for the sake of being able to get stronger, to be able to take care of yourself and your kids, that both of these aspects are going to be very important. And if you have a training program that is very, very, very low in either of those consistently, then might not be the best for you. However, while both of these are important, training volume without any sort of intensity is nearly a waste of time. Whereas having something that is higher intensity but maybe low volume, it's probably not optimal if it's super super low volume and super super high intensity. However, you will find that you will make some progress by an approach like that, as opposed to the former of a high volume but low intensity. Think of that bodyweight squat example. There is a point where you will probably make no further meaningful progress beyond a certain point. Whereas the danger with the high intensity and low volume side is perhaps injury. If you are just doing 1 rep maxes and that's it, that's your entire workout or your entire set of exercises for a particular muscle group or movement pattern. That's probably something that you're going to be risking on that, as opposed to doing more moderate loads. And I'm talking about injury, acutely in a particular workout and maybe just over time too, if that's all you ever did. So we need to make sure that we're not looking at these as mutually exclusive. We can look at them as both important. We can agree that these are both important aspects here. And if you're sitting here listening to this thinking, okay, I'm tracking, but again, I'm not super intent on trying to pick a side on this debate that I just, 15 minutes ago found out even existed. Tell me what I need to know as it pertains to my workouts. So let's finish up with this here. I have an alternate episode title and for this episode, and it's how to build a workout program as a parent. And that is what I'm going to go over here. I have a few steps that you can take care of when you are trying to either build your own workout program, or if you're trying to find one online that matches what it is that you're looking to get out of it. If that's a strength program, if it's a hypertrophy program, muscle building, if it's a combination of the two, if it's something that incorporates some kind of mobility. These are the kinds of things that you need to have an idea of before you join in on a program, just because some coach said that you should, or because that they have a ton of clients that have had really great success with it. You need to make sure that that program is really going to match your needs. So here's what my recommendation would be: whether you're building this yourself or trying to find something that matches, start with minimal volume and focus on building training intensity. This is a great approach that I've used in my own training for many, many years and clients' training for many, many years. And the benefit of this is that the volume side, we can build that up over the course of time, but training volume is not going to be the main driving factor of the adaptations that you're looking for, strength wise, hypertrophy wise. That's going to be primarily due to the intensity side of things. If you are only ever doing those body weight squats, but you're adding tons and tons of volume, you're doing tons of repetitions and tons of sets and tons of workouts that involve these squats over the course of a week, that is not going to be very effective. So if you start with minimal volume and you build that intensity, that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to result in a couple of things, and it's going to require a couple of things. Um, on both ends of that, it's going to look like building up really great form for whatever exercise it is that you're doing. And we talk about form from two different sides. One is the injury prevention side of it, but the second is making sure that you are actually getting the adaptation out of it that you want to get. And you need to have good enough form on an exercise to where you are actually applying tension to the muscle that your target muscle group that you're looking at applying it to, and you're looking at building in some way or another. So that is why we talk so much about this. And you can build that intensity, and that will help build your form. And you'll need to have a focus on building good form as you go into that. And you'll be able to build intensity. It's kind of like a snowball. It's a positive feedback loop from there. And so that's going to be a great place to start. Is you can start with that lower volume approach, and you can build the intensity as you go along. As a real quick plug for my own program, it does fit in exactly with what I'm talking about, which is why I'm bringing it up. But for my Strong Shepherds group training program, this is exactly the approach that I take in it. We have a fairly low training volume. We're training 3 times a week. It's three total body workouts. It's really two separate total body workouts, and we repeat the first one for the third workout of the week. So it's an ABA sort of pattern. And in this, there are not 10 different exercises per workout, and there are certainly not 10 different exercises for the same muscle group in the course of a workout or over the course of a week. So it is a lower training volume program. It's not super low, but it is a little bit lower than a lot of people would expect. And that is why I focus so much on this idea of the difference between what feels productive and what is productive. Because you might do a workout in the Strong Shepherds program and think, yeah, I feel like that was a lot less than I typically would do. Why are we only doing 2 sets of this? Why are we only doing 3 sets of this? Why aren't we doing 5 sets of 20, and doing 3 exercises for that muscle group? There are many reasons, but this is one of those, is that we are starting with that lower volume and building the intensity from there. And from the intensity side of it, our RIR, which I'll talk about here next, builds over the course of the program. Over the course of each program is 5 weeks long. So it starts with the deload, and then builds up from there into the fifth week, which is peak week, which is where we get into some very low RIRs, including RIRs of 0, where you are actively trying to reach muscular failure. So that's sort of the progression of how I approach all of this, and this seems to be a really really solid approach for parents like you because it doesn't leave you overly taxed in any one muscle group. Think of like a leg day. We don't do leg days in this program, at least not yet, and at least not with some nuance behind it. We're not doing a full leg day to where you are just crushed for the following week and you can't do anything. Nor are we doing an arms day where your biceps and triceps are totally shot to where you can't even do your hair the next day. That's not the goal of this here, and neither is that going to be super helpful in your workouts themselves either. So, talking about that RIR and the intensity side of it, let's talk about quantifying intensity, right? I mentioned this earlier, but quantifying intensity, there are two main scales that you'll see, and I'll give you a real quick overview of the two of those. One is going to be RIR, which is reps in reserve. This is a scale that I like to use over the second one, but to each their own in this regard, that RIR, reps in reserve, can be a really great way to be able to quantify how hard you're actually working. And the way that you might approach this is let's say you do a set of 10. You can then ask yourself after that 10th repetition, you stopped, doing it, but you can ask yourself, how many more repetitions could I have done if I didn't intentionally stop at 10? And you may say, well, I probably could have done another, one or two, maybe I could have done two extra repetitions. So that would have been that set, you could have quantified that as two RIR, two reps in reserve, meaning that you did 10, but you could have done an extra two. And that goes for any number of repetitions in a set. If you could still do an RIR of 2 on a set of 20. That means that you did 20 and you think I could have done maybe two more. That's a fairly low RIR, where you have, 3 or 2 or 1. But if you are somewhere like, you think, hey, I did 10, but I probably could have done another 10 more. That means that you likely were not working as intensely as you had thought that you were. And so your RIR of 10 was probably much higher than you had anticipated, and is going to be much higher than you would hope for in your working set. So you make a note of that, and you aim on decreasing that by way of increasing the load. Perhaps is one way of doing it. RPE is the other scale. This is rate of perceived exertion. And this is essentially um, asking yourself after a set, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how tough was that? On from a 1 or a 0, even being just very easy, very minimal effort. Um, Whereas a 10 would be just total maximal, could not do anything else. You are just so glad that that set is over. So RPE can also be another scale that you can use. It can be a little bit more intuitive to start out with, but I do tend to focus on teaching clients about the RIR scale to be able to more actively, more maybe objectively quantify this, because it's not just, oh, how do I feel about this? It's how many do I actually think that, how many more reps do you think I actually could do, as opposed to, well, that was a 8 out of 10. That is, people might quantify things differently even using the same scale that way. So anyway, quantifying intensity is something that I would encourage you to do if you are building your own program, or if you're finding a program, is finding a program that does use some kind of intensity marker or scale like these. I would also encourage you to, in the on the topic of intensity, is to look at a couple of ways of boosting your intensity. And this is where I started, of starting with lower volume and building that intensity. Let's talk about how we might do that. First of all, like I just mentioned, you might want to use a scale like RIR or RPE to help quantify that. Just by way of quantifying your intensity, as opposed to getting after a workout and being like, wow, yep, that was tough, and then that's the entirety of your follow-up thought process with how the workout went and what you need to do next time. You can use these scales to be able to quantify that, write that down, jot that down, whether you're using an app or pen and paper. Did that for years. uh, this is going to be a great opportunity to be able to practice quantifying these things, and they will take time. No matter which scale you use, they will take time to be able to get a little bit more accurate, and to be able to understand, okay, yeah, this is what an RPE of 8 really feels like, or this is what an RIR of 2 really feels like. So that is where I would start, is to start getting down and dirty in the data and quantifying your intensity. The second thing that I would recommend is increasing one metric at a time in your workouts, and you can think about this over the course of a workout or just a specific exercise or group of exercises for a specific muscle group. You have many metrics that you can increase in order to boost your intensity in that particular exercise. You can increase the load, of course. You can increase the number of repetitions. You can increase the number of sets you do of that exercise. You could do increase the number of exercises that you use for that particular muscle group. So if you are doing a squat, for example, and you are really wanting to build up your quads, you could, if you're using 135 pounds, you could try 140 pounds. That would be a way of increasing the load. You could increase the reps. Let's say you're doing a set of 10, maybe you shoot for an 11th or 12th rep. Instead of doing maybe two sets of 10, maybe you try a third set of 10. Or if you're also wanting to build up your quads, maybe instead of just doing squats, maybe you also add something like leg extensions. That would be a way of increasing the number of exercises for that muscle group. So you have a lot of ways of physically working on boosting your intensity, and any good strength training or hypertrophy program is going to be include a combination of all of these different metrics, and it will likely give you some sort of direction on which of those metrics you should be focusing on at any one time. I mention increasing one metric at a time because if you increase multiple metrics, that's going to be all at once. That's going to be a really tough gig to keep up if you're trying to increase the weight of the bar and the number of repetitions and the number of sets that you're doing. That is not going to be a winning strategy. And so you also won't be able to have much of a guide for troubleshooting if things don't go as linear as you had thought they were. Then you don't really have a great way to be able to decide, hey, was it because I increased this or because I increased this? So that's why I get on people for, okay, let's just focus on one thing at a time for a week or two or three, and then we can work on something else. A final tip on this here is that if it's possible, and again, if you're building your own workout program, you can focus on this. If you're looking at this from a pre-built program or a group program like Strong Shepherds, if it's possible, spread out your exercises for a particular muscle group across multiple workouts. And what I mean by this is, let's use the squat, for example, and with the quads, just like we've been talking about. You have kind of a couple of many different approaches, but let's use kind of two ends of the spectrum here. Let's say that you have two workouts per week that each have three exercises for your quads. Does that sound like that's going to be any better or worse or different than doing a single workout that has six exercises for that muscle group? So it's still over the course of a week, still the same total number of exercises for that muscle group, but one is going to be spread out over two separate workouts with three exercises each, and the other is going to be just plowing through all six of those exercises right in a row. I would argue from the research and from my experience that spreading out those exercises is going to be a much better approach from a physical and physiology point of view, and from a recovery point of view, and from a mental point of view. I would argue that there's no reason outside of maybe scheduling reasons that you would want to pile all those up all right in a row. So I would recommend spreading those out if possible. And that's exactly what we do in my group training program. And so, no matter what it is that you're taking your approach for your own workout program, I would recommend spreading those out so that way you're able to apply yourself more fully to each of those exercises, if that makes sense. All right, so that is my little spiel on how to build a workout program as a parent, fitting into the bigger picture of weighing in on the volume and intensity debate. I have about a minute left here, and I'm going to use that to share the fact that Christmas is coming up at the time of this recording, and we are so pumped. This is my personal update here. We are so pumped for this Christmas season, and this is with a 1.5, almost 2 year old, and a 3.5 year old. They are both girls are really kind of getting into the Christmas spirit, and they are loving everything that we're doing with it, both from the tradition side of it and the gifts and the Christmas tree and all of that, as well as the actual truth and background side of it, of really pointing them to, hey, the reason why we celebrate Christmas is because of Jesus' birth, but really the why Jesus was born in the first place. And that has been an amazing conversation to be able to teach our two little ones even at this young age here. So, all right. I'll leave you with that. That's it for today's episode. If you learned anything new in this episode or found it helpful in one way or another, would you take a quick screenshot of the podcast and post it to your story on social media. That would be the best way to be able to introduce the Blue Shoes Fitness podcast to more parents just like yourself. And as always, if you have any future podcast topic ideas, feel free to send those to me as well. All right, I'm Coach Jay. Thanks for hanging with me, and we'll see you next time.